Into chapter 3 we go. Chapter 3. Just think about where we are right now. Chapter 1, what did we do? Rack your brain. What did we do? We talked about how God created man with body, soul, right? With the soul, intellect, will. The intellect, will being filled only by God's grace. With Adam being created, man being created to be communion with God, to receive that grace. The tree, man's ability to exercise free will. Man rejecting God's grace. Man living in a world that's dark, that is removed from God's grace, even though we're created to participate in it, to receive it, to cooperate with it, right? So what do? We recognize that we had an ultimate gap from where we're called to be, union with God, right? That was chapter 1, recognizing we need our souls to be filled by sanctifying grace, something we cannot get on our own. Chapter 2, we went into and realized that from the very beginning, right, from Genesis 3:15, from right after that rejection of God's grace and mercy is continual, right? It doesn't stop. His love is forever, right? And so what do we see? We see God's promise of redemption, God's promise to bring us back, to offer us that grace that we rejected again, right? That was the proto-evangelium. And what do we see? That's a great promise, but stumble down through generations to Noah, and you have a world filled with chaos and sin, where nobody knew God at the time of Abraham. Remember that. The time of Abraham, nobody knows God, right? The God, the creator of all things. There's idols, there's God's lowercase g, right? So God comes to Abraham, right? Here we have the new divine economy. Remember that God's going to come to us in our sinfulness and going to reveal slowly, gradually to us that we are called to be different, that we are called to be set apart. Set apart means holy, consecrated. We are called to be set apart and holy, sanctified. We are called to be that, right? Outside of the mundane, the world that Abraham's living in. God calls us out of that, right? Which is why with the covenant with Abraham, he says, you're not sacrificing your firstborn son, right? The whole idea of sacrificing Isaac, you're not doing that. Who did that? Everyone else. Right? So we enter into this understanding that we are not like everybody else, that you are not like everybody else, that you are called to be something different, to be something greater. You are called out of this broken, sinful, ugly, dark world, and God is trying to tell Abraham that there is something more, right? That we're missing something. And so begins the line of the covenants after Noah, where God gradually and slowly reveals to us sinfulness, what we're created for, the moral code, that God and us were called to be in relationship, that we're not, God is the appeasing God and we're down here, the little ants below, that God is showing us that he is who is, right? He has a name. He is we can call upon him. He's personal, right? God is revealing all these things through Abraham, through Moses, through David, that we are in the midst of sin, evil, death, desiring a king, desire worldly things. And God saying, man, I'm going to use all this broken stuff to continually show you, right, that we are to be in a relationship, that you are called to be something greater, that is not about power, worldly land, worldly possessions, that it's about God, relationship with him, it's about grace, it's about holiness, it's about love, it's about sin, it's about something greater that he calls us to. He calls us something so much more. It's about needing our hearts to be filled. We're created for love, we're created for grace, and we don't have it, right? So God, at the end of all things, right, with the promise of David that your line's going to be forever, right, that it's going to continue, that I'm going to send a Messiah of your line, right, that I'm going to build a house, right, that all these good things are going to come from David. And all of a sudden, David falls apart. The line of kings fails. And the prophets are there saying, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget. Don't forget what God has showed us through the covenants, right? You can fall. We can turn into sin so many times, but let's not go back to Abraham or the time of Noah. Let's not go back to the time of the judges. Let's not go back to that stuff, say the prophets. The prophets are saying, remember that we are holy people, a chosen people, that God has revealed to us that we are called out of this stuff. And he is trying to show us that our hearts need more, right? God has prepared the people in the Old Testament for a greater covenant, a covenant that is everlasting, a covenant that doesn't fail, that fulfills David, that fulfills Moses, that fulfills Abraham, that fulfills Noah and Adam, that brings it all back together, that continues it all, right, and completes it. A covenant to where we can be in union with God as he created us to be, right? There's an infinite gap, but all this is leading to a promise that there is a covenant to bring all of mankind back together in an infinite way, right? That there will be a Redeemer. There will be a Messiah. There will be one that brings us, that atones for our sins, that puts us in relationship with God. That's where we are coming into chapter 3, right? That's pretty intense, right? The key to this chapter is not to see it just as, here we go into the New Testament. I want you to use your mind to continue the covenants of the Old Testament. Continue the Old Testament. Continue the mind that we're in the age of the prophets, that everything's still dispersed, right? That the Assyrians came in, the Babylonians came in, that everybody's sort of wiped out and dispersed. But there's this hope. There's this hope for a Messiah, right? Everything's fallen apart still, but there's the covenants. There's a promise. Let's enter there, not as New Testament, start new, but as a continuation of the Old. And as this promise is out there, just hanging, here we enter into Jewish history. Keep that in mind. We're entering into the history of the Jews. And here we zoom in after the prophets into this little town. And we zoom in on this little girl, this woman, in her teens, this little girl named Mary, in this little town. And we zoom into her and see that as God sought our cooperation at the very first moment with Adam and Eve and the tree in the garden, he sought that we would say yes to do his will, to say yes to being in union with him, to say yes to his grace. So God comes to this little woman. And in the same way he started creation with free will, so too he brings about recreation, redemption with free will. And God depends on human cooperation to bring about the redemption of all of mankind in the world, to bring back that infinite grace that we long for, that our souls need. And so here we have, this chapter talks about that human cooperation, Mary, the new Eve, her fiat, her yes. Her fiat means her yes. And St. Joseph's yes and her service. And St. John the Baptist's preaching. And all of this human cooperation saying yes to God, yes to God's will, yes to the covenants, yes to God and his promises, and that we are called apart, and no to sin. No to the life of the world around us. Keep that in mind, right? Look around you. We're surrounded by culture, and everything's pulling us in to see the life of the world around us. Where everything around us is calling us to be like them. But what we learned from last chapter, the Old Testament tells us we're not called to be like them. We're called to be other. You're called to be saints. You're called to be holy. You're called to be apart. You're called to be different. Right? And so that's what Mary, St. Joseph, John the Baptist hold on to with their understanding of the covenants, with God's promise. And they turn away from sin and they say yes to God. We believe and we trust. That's key to this chapter, understanding that. And it's key to our hearts to know how we're supposed to live in this world. It's so easy to be pulled down by our phones, by social media, by a world of sports, right? And living and so much into it, and money, that it becomes our idols, right? They become like everybody else. But God's telling us, no, be more. So the next key to this chapter is understanding why God became man. God became man to reconcile people to himself, to reconcile us to himself. He became man to manifest and show his love. He came man to be a model of holiness. He became man to give us a share in divine life and to defeat the devil. Oftentimes we see Jesus on the cross and say he forgives us. But there's so much more, right? Jesus lived 33 years. Jesus came not just on the cross and then he was gone. He was born, right? He had an infancy. He had a small life and a family, right? He grows and he forms apostles. Why? He does all this stuff before he dies on the cross, right? So we realize there are more reasons for the incarnation that we can understand, that we can go into. Jesus' life, right, shows us so much more than just forgiveness. Redemption is so much more than just forgiveness. Redemption is tied into all that God created us to be, original justness and holiness, all that we rejected. Redemption is showing us man fully alive. So we're going to look into that. That's key to this chapter, seeing why God became man, to show us man fully alive. And then we see a key to this chapter is because of this, we look at the whole life of Christ and say it's where redemption happens, right? It is redemption, not that one moment on the cross, not just the paschal mystery of his passion, death, resurrection, and ascension, but his incarnation, his being in the womb of Mary at conception to his death and assumption. That entire thing is part of this mystery of redemption that teaches us about why and how we're redeemed. From his birth all the way to his assumption, even before his birth, in the conception in Mary's womb. Christ's entire life is part of the mystery of redemption. And the last part for this chapter for us to understand is that Christ has freely justified us before God the Father, whom Christ reveals to us. Christ freely justifies us, and what that means. That's what we got to see. Our last point in this chapter is saying, what does it mean that he justifies us? What does it mean that he reveals the Father? What does it mean that we're now justified? And what do we have to do next? That's our introduction to this chapter. Boom.